When I became an environmental journalist, I wanted to make a difference. I wanted to speak the Earth's truth to power, to tell the story of good going up against evil, of David taking it to Goliath. And then I took too long to write a book about bees, and I realized it's not that simple. It happened like this. About 5 years ago, I wrote a magazine article about a quirky beekeeper who had 10,000 beehives and was struggling to keep his bees alive. Soon after I started working on this story, a well-timed disaster happened. Well-timed for me, anyway. In late 2006, the nation's bees began dying in weird and unsettling ways. They simply vanished from their hives. The scientific community hadn't seen this before and didn't know what caused it. They named this strange new syndrome colony collapse disorder, or CCD, and it made front-page news all over the country. After my story came out, I was contacted by publishers asking me if I was interested in writing a book on the subject. In fact, I was, and I set to work. But around this time, something else fortuitous happened, for me personally, if not for my career as an environmental journalist. I had a baby. And she was awfully cute and completely rewired my heartstrings, but was not terribly conducive to turning a bee book around quickly. So while I swaddled and dandled and stuffed organic food down her gullet, other writers weighed in on the subject. In the next couple of years, a number of books and articles came out, and many of them illuminated the dreadfulness of the honeybee situation with this quote by Albert Einstein: "If the bee disappeared off the surface of the globe, then man would have no more than 4 years of life left." Now, the reason Einstein felt this way is because honeybees do a lot more than just make honey. They also pollinate 1 out of 3 bites of food we eat, including the really good stuff like cherries, berries, apples, melons, and almonds. And Einstein, smartest guy ever, understood this and sounded the alarm. Except here's the thing. Einstein never said that. He died in 1955. The first mention of this quote was in 1994 in a pamphlet distributed by French beekeepers during a protest. And there's also this: it simply isn't true. The first honeybees arrived in North America in the 1620s on the same ships that brought the English colonists and their crops. But of course, humans, Native Americans, had lived there for millennia without the help of honeybees, and they seemed to be doing okay, that is, until Europeans arrived with their bees and diseases. If the honeybee were to disappear off the face of the earth, our diet would be far less interesting. We'd eat less fruit and more grain, but we wouldn't starve. Now, as I dug into my research and began to learn more about the honeybee situation, I also began to wonder if the recent bee literature wasn't also missing something even bigger. You see, one thing all these books agreed on was that the likely reason honeybees were dying in such staggering numbers was because of a new type of pesticide called neonicotinoids. Neonics are systemic neurotoxins that are absorbed throughout a plant and remain toxic to insects for a year or more after application. So it makes perfect sense that chronic low-dose exposures to these poisons might weaken or disorient bees. But as I continued working on my book and dallied and played with the baby and whatnot, studies began trickling out, and none of them seemed to offer any definitive evidence that neonics were the culprit behind CCD. Nor could I find any evidence that in those few countries that had banned neonics, like France and Italy, bees were doing any better. And in some places where they had plenty of neonics, bees were doing fine. Now, the most striking example of this is in Australia, where the bees have been healthy and there's never been a reported case of CCD. They have plenty of neonics in Australia. What they don't have there, but do have everywhere else in the world, is the Varroa mite, a nasty, tick-like creature that latches onto the honeybee and sucks the life first out of the bee, and then out of its colony, and eventually out of entire beekeeping operations. It first came to the US in 1987, and by the mid-1990s, it had killed nearly every feral hive in the country and many managed hives as well. It is the scourge of modern beekeeping. But if Australia's bees were healthy and ours weren't, how could it be that neonics were the root of the problem? And how was it that these books seemed so convinced that they had the right answer? This is, I think, symptomatic of a larger problem in environmental storytelling. It's complicated stuff, yet we approach it with our fight-or-flight, 24-hour news brains. We bring to our storytelling a formula of sorts, one that lies at the heart of nearly every modern environmental narrative. It goes something like this. X is evil. X is an unprecedented disaster, and it's really evil. And for X here, you can substitute pesticides or GMOs or SUVs, whatever the heated environmental battle of the day. Now, this is a satisfying story with obvious demons and easy solutions. But it's not always true. And it's not always helpful. A couple of examples. During the Gulf spill a couple of years ago, journalists flocked to the Gulf region, and the news was full of images of oiled pelicans and despoiled shorelines. But it wasn't actually all that easy to find those oiled pelicans. With only 25 miles of heavy oiling along the entire 1,600-mile coastline, journalists had to charter boats and hire guides and hunt for oil. The Gulf is thought to absorb 50 million gallons of oil annually from natural seeps in the ocean floor. It's well adapted to oil. It's less well adapted to dispersants and dredging and artificial berms and booms in ecologically sensitive areas. And this raises a question. Is it possible that the measures we took to stave off the oil were more harmful to the Gulf than simply letting it flow? In our breathless coverage of this crisis, we didn't have that conversation. Now, another example, fracking. Now, this is an incredibly emotional issue, and the mere mention of it can often incite riots in many places. And I don't want to belittle the very real harm that fracking can cause. Hydraulic fracturing to extract natural gas uses lots of water and nasty chemicals, which may, though the science is by no means clear, get into the water table. And it also brings noise and pollution and heavy industry to nice places that aren't accustomed to that kind of hard living. The news coverage has been quick to point that out. It's been less quick to point this out. 2011, a year of positive GDP growth, saw our lowest level of carbon dioxide emissions, in 2 decades. The top line there is GDP growth, the lower line is CO2, and you can see in 2011 it took this dip down. Now, there are a number of reasons for this. A warm winter, a still slow economy, and continuing progress with efficiency standards and renewables. But it's also because shale gas and fracking and other new methods of extracting natural gas have brought prices down to a point where they're competitive with, even cheaper than coal, which emits twice the CO2. And those low prices have allowed utilities to mothball coal plants at levels not even dreamed of 5 years ago. You can see here that big drooping rectangle there, that's coal, and that was how much it dropped in the last year. So, does fracking have some environmental benefits? It probably does. Can it be done responsibly enough to mitigate the social and environmental costs? We don't know. There simply isn't enough information out there to know. We haven't had that conversation in the news or in our communities. You're either opposed to fracking or you're a big oil Neanderthal, in which case no one's going to listen to you anyway. Now back to bees. Here's another little factoid that is definitely not fortuitous for my career as a chronicler of environmental disaster. There are more bees in the world than ever. Yes, America's bees are dying at the unsustainable rate of about a third of the national herd each year, for reasons that have less to do with CCD than with the stresses of modern agriculture and globalized pests and pathogens. And America's beekeepers desperately need our help to figure out what's going on. But right now, those bees are being replaced at an equally brisk pace, thanks to sophisticated queen rearing operations and to the fact that there are now bees in places they didn't used to be, like China and hipster backyards across the country. And this is what I concluded when my book came out last year. The tale of the modern honeybee is a story of loss and failure and fragility, yes. But it's also a story of resilience. And we're not having that conversation either. Too often, we sacrifice the complicated truth at the altar of simplicity, at the altar of a good disaster story, in the name of what we want to believe. But I don't think we have to do that. So this is my suggestion for those of us seeking to explain these difficult and divisive environmental issues. Stop. Have a baby. Or if that's not your thing, pretend you had a baby. And take a brief maternity leave, a time out of sorts, from the hyperdrive news environment. Listen to people you consider suspect. Suspect people you trust, like Einstein. Consider information that explodes that simple narrative we rely on so heavily. Accept this task with humility and without preconception. Entertain complexity. Have that conversation. Thank you.